Hello and welcome to this BCS interview. Today I'm with Dr. Richard Wilson, the Chief Executive of Tiger, the trade industry body for the games industry. No, Richard, could you just explain to us who are Tiger, what do you do?
Sure. So Tiger is a trade association. We represent the UK games development and digital publishing sector. Actually, I'll say we represent the UK games industry. We also have some European members as well, but our core constituency is in the UK. We were established in 2001. I took over in 2008, and our top priority has been to make UK games industry the most competitive industry in the world. And so we've done that, or we seek to do that in three different ways. Firstly, we work to represent the industry at a political level. So we work to represent the industry in Westminster, in the Scottish Parliament, and also in Brussels. We also work to raise the profile of the industry, not simply in the trade press, but in the wider national media, so that people have a proper understanding of the significance of the sector.
Okay.
And then thirdly, we work to help our members to be more competitive, and we do this in a number of different ways. We organise networking events, we negotiate discounts from third-party suppliers, and we provide best practice information and advice. So there's various ways we're working to help our members to be more competitive and build sustainable businesses.
You say you work on a political level. What sort of things are you talking about then? Is it influencing government and policy, I suppose?
Yes, we've had a pretty ambitious political agenda. We've worked to convince the UK government, and indeed all the four key political parties in the UK, Conservatives, the Liberal Democrats, the Labour Party and the Scottish National Party, to appreciate and recognise the importance of the video games industry. But quite apart from the general point about recognising the importance of the sector, we've had some specific policy goals. Our top priority has been to introduce a tax relief for games production, rather similar or analogous to the film tax credit.
Okay.
And this has been a 5-year campaign for Tiger, and we were finally successful in 2012 in the March budget, and this tax relief should be coming into effect this year once the European Commission gives the green light.
Okay.
That's been our top priority, but we've also campaigned for more investment in higher education. Higher education is really important to the games sector because a huge proportion of the people who work in the sector need to be graduate level, or the vocational equivalent, but typically graduate level. And it's really important that higher education is properly supported. And we've also worked to impress upon policymakers the importance of a flexible migration policy, because sometimes with the best will in the world, you can't always locate the ideal people we want from the home market. Sometimes you have to bring in very talented people from overseas as well. So our top priority has really been tax and skills, and that's given us a pretty ambitious agenda over the last few years.
Okay. So you talked about tax credits. Like you said, this has been in quite a long discussion process. So how do they work, and why are they so important for UK-based games companies?
There are a number of reasons why the tax credits are important. The first reason is that our overseas competitors have tax breaks.
Right.
So Canada, in particular, has very, very generous levels of tax relief at the level of different provinces. Quebec, in particular, has turbo-powered their games industry through very ambitious tax credits, very generous tax credits. But there are also 19 to 20 states within the United States which also have tax credits. Singapore has a similar system. China and South Korea support their industries in different ways. And France has a tax credit within the UK as well. So our key competitors have had tax breaks for games production. The UK has traditionally taken the view that it shouldn't support specific sectors. At least that's been official policy. In fact, British governments always intervene and support particular sectors. But as it happens, we haven't had a tax break in the UK, and so we've seen jobs and investment flowing away from the UK to North America. So just to give you one example, between 2008 and 2011, the Canadian games industry grew by 33% in terms of headcount. Our own industry was literally decimated. We lost 10% of the workforce.
Really?
And we were able to demonstrate that around 40% of the jobs that were lost went to Canada. And to North America. So we've really had to have this tax credit partly to enable us to compete on a more level playing field. That's the first reason. The second reason is that so much of global investment in the games industry comes from big multinational companies, and they're obviously attracted to particular jurisdictions. And even today, getting publisher investment into the games industry is probably one of the most attractive forms of finance, because it's very hard to attract bank finance, because they don't tend to invest in risky IP-based projects. So, in simple terms, we need the tax credits for two reasons: one, to compete on a level playing field, and two, to improve access to finance.
And
sorry, how do they work?
And how do they work?
Yes. And again, in simple terms, what the tax credit will do will be that if your game makes a profit, you can use the tax credit to reduce the amount of tax that is payable on that profit. But if your game makes a loss, you can use the tax credit to actually get some money back from the Treasury. So in that sense, if you're a startup company, you've invested in some imaginative and potentially risky IP, it hasn't necessarily created a profit, it's actually made a small loss perhaps, then you can get some money back from the Treasury. But it's good because it still makes the film sustainable. It helps to encourage innovation in that respect. And the tax credit can also work to attract third-party finance from venture capitalists, for example.
Right.
Once they know that a tax relief is in operation, is in place, it makes investing in those firms infinitely more attractive. So, as I say, in simple terms, if you're making a profit, you use the tax credit to reduce the profit, the tax you pay on that profit. If you're making a loss, you get some money back from the Treasury.
Okay. Now, I think I saw something that you put out a release recently saying that you wanted to be tax relief on projects that weren't quite finished or that weren't quite successful.
Yes, that's right.
If you could just explain why you wanted that to happen, and could it not be seen as you're not promoting failure, but you see what I mean?
No, it's a
perfectly
understandable question to ask. Again, we've been influenced in part by the film industry in this regard, because in the film industry, where the tax credit is in operation, if a project or a company has been spending on a project for a number of months, they've hired actors, teams, and so on and so forth, and they've run up costs. And if that film had to be canned for various reasons, for example, perhaps the lead actor died or was no longer available, then you could still use the film tax credit to cover your costs on that project. So, on the basis of equality, we believe a similar scheme should apply to the games industry.
Of course.
And in the games industry's case, there's the additional challenge that the developers in the UK typically are small and medium-sized enterprises. They won't have huge resources or finance at all. Most of the money will come from global publishers. And you can find that UK game developers can be working for many months at a time on a project, and then 5 months down the line, the big multinational company will say, sorry, we're not going to do this anymore. And so the company in question could have run up several months of debt, in effect. So as part of the programme of making sure that we have a sustainable studio base in the UK, we believe that council projects, in principle, should be eligible for games tax relief. But we do have the caveat being that the projects in question should be able to pass the tax credit requirements, which would include passing the British Cultural Test, which you may want for me to explain a little bit.
Yeah, please do,
So because we're within the European Union, you can't just simply introduce a tax credit for games production. Now in Canada you can do that, in the United States you can do that.
Right, they're autonomous.
Exactly. But because we've conceded a certain amount of sovereignty to Brussels, the only way you can have a tax credit for a specific industry is if you can justify it on different grounds, or particular grounds. In the games industry's case, in the film industry's case, we justify it on cultural grounds. So we've argued that not only has the UK games industry been competing on an unlevel playing field against Canada and the United States, but connect to that point that there's an undersupply or a market failure in the production of culturally British video games.
Right, okay.
So, because so many of the multinational companies that invest in games tend to be American-based or Japanese-based, they may have less interest in developing a historical game, for example, that's based on some aspect of British European history, or maybe less interested in developing some aspect of British culture from literature or myths and legends. With a tax credit in place, it will be possible to ensure there's an adequate supply of culturally British video games. So to get the games tax relief through Brussels, we've had to have a cultural British test, and that means you have to score a certain number of points on this test, and you'll get points for staffing British or European citizens, whether your game is based on some aspect of British European history, whether you're using some aspect of new technology, and so on and so forth.
So you think we'll see more cricket games? Kind of?
I hope so.
No, obviously, the games industry is a huge part of the IT industry in the UK. Why is it so? Why is it so important, and why should it therefore have these tax credits and have a leg up, so to speak? Apart from obviously the competition aspect.
Yes, well, I think it's for two reasons really. I think the first reason is that when you look at the British economy at the current time, we see that it's stagnated for 3 to 5 years. We see that inflation is above target. The banks aren't lending any money. There aren't that many sources of business-led investment and export-oriented growth that are obviously happening. So it's important for UK policymakers to support those sectors which are investment-driven and which have a capacity to export and to help rebalance the UK economy away from an over-reliance on financial services, for example. And so one of those sectors, not all by any means obviously, but one of those sectors is clearly the video games industry. Other sectors that I would flag up would be sectors like higher education, for example, aerospace, and some of the other creative industries. So the video games industry is one of those industries that can help to rebalance the economy and can help to contribute to an export-led recovery. So the sector in question in the UK, the games industry, It contributes about £1 billion UK GDP. It provides very high skilled employed, 9,000 staff work in game development. Over 80% of those are qualified at degree level or above, which is well above the national average. 95 to 99% of game developers actually export their content, which again is way above the average for most British firms. And they have a high tendency to invest in R&D. Again, a typical firm would be investing around 15% of their turnover in R&D. So it's exactly the kind of sector we want to support in the future. And then connected with that point, and why we should be supporting this industry, is because it's a growth industry. PricewaterhouseCoopers suggests that by around 2015, 2016, the industry will be worth around $80 billion globally. So we want to have a part of that action. We want a piece of the pie. So it makes sense, not simply from a partisan reason to support the games industry. I mean, actually I would support it, but from a wider policy perspective, as part of a programme supporting the UK economy, we want to support those sectors like the games industry, which can support economic growth.
Of course. And obviously, you touched then on various aspects of education. Now, there's been a lot of change and a lot of talk about the way that ICT is taught in schools and higher education. What are your thoughts on the way it's been and the way it's now changing?
I think the first thing that I would say is that there's always a tendency, when you're obviously speaking from your own country's perspective, to identify the failings in your education system. And I think you only need to have a cursory look at other countries' education systems, and it's very hard to find one that's perfect. Finland is sometimes flagged up as being a fantastic country in terms of education. But some of our similar sized countries, similar sized populations, like France and Germany, even those countries aren't beyond criticism in terms of education. And people within their own countries will make those points too. So I think it's important to emphasise that first of all. In the case of the UK, and perhaps particularly in the case of England, I think that the teaching of STEM subjects, science, technology, maths, so on and so forth, has probably not been as good as it should be. And perhaps to be even more precise, the attainment levels that are reached by 16-year-olds are disappointing. So I think even today, after successive governments' attempts to drive up standards at GCSE level, I think we're still only seeing approximately half of all GCSE candidates getting a good maths qualification, for example. And I think it's a similar proportion in terms of science. So I think that we've had a historic weakness in this regard, and that's been connected also to a historic weakness in terms of the provision of high quality vocational education. So I think that's a general point which I would make. I think more recently, I think we've seen disappointing numbers of people studying maths and science subjects. Glad to say over the last few years there's been an increase. I think the most recent set of results from 2012 showed that maths and physics were, I think, amongst the most popular of A-level and GCSE subjects, which is great. So there has been a bit of a turnaround. But if you look at it over the last 20 years, if you take that wider perspective, there's been a disappointing number of people, or proportion of people studying those subjects. So it's great to see some improvement, but there's obviously a long way to go. And I think specifically looking at ICT education in schools, I think there's a case for teaching ICT. I mean, we use ICT all the time. But I think it's also good to have the opportunity to study computer science. And this is something TIE has been arguing for since 2008. Our position is that perhaps it's not necessarily vital for every school to teach every child up to a high level of computer science, but we do want the option to be there, and we want to encourage more people to be able to study computer science, to increase the supply of people who can study computer science at A-level and go on to study at degree level. And I think perhaps it's at the degree level which has been the most worrying decline in the proportion of full-time and part-time students studying computer science over the last, I think, roughly 10-15 years. So those are generic remarks which should basically say that I think that the supply, the total output of people who are capable of studying science subjects, and computer science in particular, has not been as good as it should be. And
are your members saying much about the sort of the standards that they're getting of graduates? Because I've heard in the past where you've had companies, they get the graduates coming in with ostensibly all the skills that they need, but they then need to spend 6 months to a year bringing them up to almost to the entry level for their requirements. What are your members saying about that sort of thing?
There's certainly some truth in that remark. I think the problem for universities is of course, they're not, in most cases, providing a vocational qualification. They're trying to provide a broad level of education, which teach a lot of generic skills as well as a lot of specialist skills. So universities are caught between a rock and a hard place in that regard.
Of course.
Games businesses, on the other hand, want people who can hit the ground running from the word go. And perhaps employers generally are very demanding in that regard. Perhaps particularly in high technology businesses, I think. So I think at the level of degree level, I think there have been some valid criticisms about the standards of some students coming out of universities. Not all by any means.
No.
And indeed, I think we're fortunate in the UK that we have a lot of very good universities which provide a lot of good courses and teach a lot of good students. So we mustn't never lose sight of that.
No.
I think it's an issue, but I don't think that it's by no means a disaster. And I think I think it's also important to emphasise actually that those people who study, for example, MSc subjects in games courses tend to be very, very good and very, very employable because of course they've had that additional year of specialisation.
Yes.
So I think it's more a question of the glass being half full rather than half empty. With regards to higher education, I think there are approximately around 50 courses offering courses specifically in games education.
Yeah.
And there are around 7,000 students come out each year, 7,500 students I think come out each year. And I think one of the things we've got to do to try and improve higher education generally, but also games courses particularly, I think is twofold. Firstly, I'd like to see over a period of time, when the public finances improve, to see greater investment in higher education. So the UK only spends about 1.2, 1.3% of GDP on higher education, whereas the States I think spends around 2.6%. Canada spends about 2.5%. South Korea about 2.6%. So I think over time, I think the UK will want to spend more on higher education, so we can have better quality, better resourced establishments which will provide for a better educational experience. So I think that's really, really important. I also think, specifically with regards to games courses, I think that we want to continue to strengthen links between industry and academia. We already have about 40% of companies in the UK that have a connection with the university, either in terms of setting some coursework, providing guest lecturing and similar such activities. So we want to encourage that even more, I think. And I think thirdly, I would say, is part of a way of trying to enhance the quality of higher education, but also to help businesses. I think really we want to be able to incentivise university businesses to work more closely together. So I think the government are looking at a number of ways in which they can make that happen. And I think that's something that should be encouraged because we want to strengthen those links because it improves knowledge transfer between businesses and academia.
Yeah, and I guess it gives the students in the courses who are actually studying these things, like we were talking about earlier, bringing them up to speed with what is required when they go into work. So that's always got to be a good thing.